In this demo, I want to walk you through the basics of combo boxes and list boxes. We've seen these in a number of demos before, but I didn't really spend time focusing on each of the data-bound properties and how they relate to one another. So I just wanted to revisit them comprehensively since they're such a pivotal data-bound control. Starting point for this demo is a simple WPF application project with a main window in it, and I added a main window view model. In the main window view model constructor, we're doing some data retrieval. As usual, we're using our ZaDB context to go out to a ZA database. We're getting some products and pushing them into an observable collection. That collection is exposed as a property called products on our view model that we can data bind to. We're also modifying the image property of each product to point to a collection of images that's in our project under the images subfolder. And we're setting two other properties on initialization here, the selected product ID and selected product, which are both exposed as properties on our view model here. So this just gives us a good data context to data bind against for our combo boxes and list boxes. We also have a relay command in the project, which we've seen in previous demos, just an iCommand object we can use to hook up buttons to point to handling in our view model, which we'll get to. So if I drop into my main window and add a basic combo box here, the basic structure is that it is an items control. So the most important property that you're going to want to set in data binding is the item source property. Here we're pointing to a products path on whatever our data context is, and you can see up above our data context is already wired up so that our main window view model is our data context. So this will cause it to be constructed. The constructor fires and loads the products, and then data binding fires and reads those products into our combo box. If that's all we put on our combo box and try to run, as we've seen before, that's not quite enough because it's just going to toString each of the product objects, and that's not really what we want. So at a bare minimum, when using a combo box, you're going to want to set the display member path property, and I'll set that to name. That basically says go to the name property on each of those products, get that out as a string, and then it's going to render a text block basically inside of the combo box list for each one of those. So running with that, now we get something a little more like what we expect. Now we see the names of each of the products in our combo box. Notice that it had started with nothing selected, and that's where some of the other data-bound properties can come in. Another one, if you're using display member path that you'll often use, is selected value path. Selected value path lets you point to another property on each one of your data-bound objects that contains some sort of identifier typically. So in our case, we can use the ID property. Hand in hand with the selected value path is the selected value property. And this is one that you can programmatically inspect based on events. If you were to hook the selection changed event, for example, you could then get the selected value or the selected index or the selected item. But in a data-bound scenario, you might push this value through a data binding into some property, especially in a view model type scenario. So we could set up a binding on this and point it to our selected product ID property on our view model, like so. Now, if we go ahead and run, notice that the combo box is not empty initially. And that's because of our initialization code back here in the view model. Remember, we loaded up the products, but we also initialized the selected product ID property to the first item in those products. Another one you could do as an alternative to selected value, generally won't do both of these, is the selected item property. Selected item gets the whole data-bound object, which will be a product object in this case, and pushes it through a binding to a property in our view model in this case. That likewise was being initialized in the constructor to the first item in the list, so we should see that selected now when it starts up. And we could go back here into our selected product setter, set a breakpoint, and see whenever it's set, our set block is being called. So we have an opportunity to invoke some logic there based on the product that's being selected. If we want to have more structure to the elements within our combo box, we can use a data template. In this case, an implicit data template, but of course an explicit one would work as well. This data template is mapped to the product type, and it uses the image property to render out an image and a text block to render out the name. With that in place, it would do nothing if we don't get rid of the display member path property, because those two are incompatible. When you say display member path, you're saying you just want to render out text based on that property. So we can get rid of both display member path and selected value path, which is not being used anymore, and go ahead and run this. And now we can see that the individual items in our combo box have the structure that we determined in our data template. And obviously we'd want to do some sizing on the combo box itself so we could show a whole item when selected. So those are the primary things you're going to use on a combo box. Always an item source when you're data binding, display member path and selected value path if you're just dealing with simple text rendering, and the selected value property to do something with it, or the selected item property to push the whole object when selected, and then to put more structure on the rendering, use data templates. All those same concepts apply to a list box. I could go in here and add a list box bound to products here. Display member path would again apply, as would selected items, selected value path, and so on. I'm going to go ahead and run here with both the combo box and list box bound to products to emphasize something about synchronization. So right now, notice I can make a selection in the list box and it has no impact on the combo box and vice versa. When you have two data-bound controls pointing to the same collection by default, there is a collection view source associated with them, but they are not synchronized with that current item in the collection view source. If you have two things like that and you want them to stay in sync, this is where the is synchronized with current item property comes in. Go ahead and set that to true on both of these items and run again. And now we can see if I select Holy Smokes up above, it's highlighted in the list below. Italian Stallion down below, it's selected up above. Now another thing you might sometimes want to do is have some other UI that is driving the selection in a combo box, list box, or data grid. So here I'm going to add a simple little search UI, a text box and a button that we can trigger. Text box is going to be bound to a property on our view model called search input, and the button is bound to a command that we're going to add. So first let me drop back to the view model and add those two properties. So here's our search input as a string input, and here's our set product command as a relay command. Now I need to initialize that product command. So in the constructor up here, I can initialize it and point it to a method called onSetProduct, and I can declare that method down below here. And you can see when that gets called through the command, I'm going to go out and use the search input text, which was pushed through thanks to two-way data binding. When I click on the button, changes focus. That causes the current value in the text box to be pushed down into that search input, and that makes it available to do a search here against our products based on the name property. And then we will push that into the selected product property. That's going to call the setter, which raises a property changed event. And because our selected item is bound to that selected product, that's going to cause the combo box to change. Because the combo box changes and is synchronized, is set on both of these, it will also cause the list box to change. So let's go ahead and run with that. And we can see down below there's a product called Taj Mahal. If I just put in Taj and search, you can see it selected up above and selected down below. Put in Smokes, search, Holy Smokes selected in both controls. So that just further emphasizes the way you can bind selected item, for example, or selected value, change the thing it's bound to in the code behind, and that will drive what's selected in the UI. A very common thing to do in model view model data binding scenarios.